this point, Mustafa Akyol will give the Muslim presentation, and we'll have responses like we have with the others. Since I've been hawking books, the two books that we're featuring is the Islamic Jesus and the Islamic Moses, and both very interesting. I enjoyed reading both of them and writing about them. So it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Doug, for this generous introduction. Thanks to Kaufman Center, Sylvia, and all her colleagues for also hosting me here. Now, we covered the Old Testament, we covered the New Testament, and I'm bringing you to the third, leg of the story, which is Islam, of course. And I'll say a few things about Islam's relationship with power in history. But before that, what Islam is, what kind of a religion is that, I'd like to say a few things about that. Excuse me? Oh, sorry. Oh, you're welcome, no worries. I thought I made a stupid mistake, probably. Now, Islam was born historically in the early 7th century, 600s, in the city of Mecca, 610. When one of the merchants in the city, Muhammad bin Abdullah, one night received revelation on a mountaintop. There's some similarity with another revelation on a mountaintop, like a burning bush, you maybe know. Moses, exactly. And just like Moses, he was an orphan, he didn't know that he was going to be a prophet. Like, unlike Jesus, so Jesus knew who he was from the beginning, right? I mean, there are infancy gospels telling that he knew that he was the Logos and Messiah. Of course, the historic Jesus versus the theology, I'm speaking of the theological one here. Muhammad didn't know. And so he heard this cave, Iqra, in this cave, he heard this divine message, Iqra, recite in the name of God. He was scared. He didn't know what this was. He thought it was a demon. He went to his house, Hadija, and asked her, what is this? He was scared. And she said, let's consult somebody in the city who knows these things. And they went to this person called Varaka, a priest, a Christian priest who wrote in Hebrew letters. Very interesting. And they told the story, and he listened to it. He said, don't worry, you're not demon possessed or anything. You are a prophet for your people. Like Moses, he said. So that's the moment Muhammad got convinced that he's really a prophet, which is receiving divine revelation. And he heard the role model, Moses. And it is not an accident, therefore, when you read the Quran for the first time, you will not hear much about Prophet Muhammad himself, because the Quran doesn't speak about him, it speaks to him, right? It doesn't narrate what he does. It's just divine messages coming to him. But you will hear about previous prophets, and among them, by far, the most mentioned figure in the Quran is Moses. The name Moses mentioned it 137 times throughout the Quran, whereas the name Muhammad is mentioned just 4 times. After Moses, there's another person who's also very frequently mentioned, the second most mentioned human being in the Quran. Can you guess who could that be? Mary is a good guess. Jesus, sorry? Joseph is not bad, he's there, but okay. Well, unfortunately, none of those. It's the Pharaoh. Some 70-something times, Pharaoh is the most, of course, not positively. He's the enemy, right? He is the enemy of God and Moses. And the struggle between the two men, and Moses and the Pharaoh, really dominate, especially the Meccan chapters, the surahs of the Quran. And it's told and retold. Now, why is that? I've thought about this issue. Some scholars commented on this issue. And the thesis I put forward in my book, The Islamic Moses, is that because Moses and his struggle with the Pharaoh and his leadership to the Israelites was the iconic story for Muslims that they could relate to. They identified with the Israelites and their suffering under the Pharaoh and their yearning for freedom from persecution. And that's why God told them that story all the time. There's one interesting nuance, by the way. The Quranic story of Moses is shorter than the Bible. Stories, because it's in different chapters, but a lot of parallels. Many things are similar. The mom puts him in a basket. The Pharaoh's family finds him. He grows in very similar. There's one interesting difference. In the Bible, Moses goes to the Pharaoh, and what does he ask for? Let my people go, right? So that they can worship God. So he asks the Pharaoh, set the Israelites free so they can worship their God. In the Quran, Moses goes to the Pharaoh. He asks that, let my people go, but he's even more insistent on something else. He says, believe in the one true God. Like he's trying to convert the Pharaoh into the true faith, which to me is a reflection of the fact that Judaism, at least in its initial phase, like a monotheism for the Jewish people, Islam is monotheism for the world. So he wants to convert the Pharaoh and the Egyptians there as well. Therefore, I agree with a few scholars who said Islam is Judaism for Gentiles, a religion which actually took the faith of Abrahamic monotheism from the Jewish people and brought it to all corners of the world. Christianity did the same thing too, before Islam. But of course, Christianity added some new elements, some new upgrades, right? The doctrine of Trinity, the idea of a divine Messiah. And these do not have their place in Judaism. There's a difference there. Also, Christianity, by and large, abandoned the idea of a law, God-given law as a part of your piety, like dietary laws or things like that. That's why our Christian friends don't have a problem with pork, I think, in general, unless they're vegetarian or some health issues. But we Muslims don't eat pork because Jews don't eat pork because we keep the same thing. We Muslims are very careful about circumcision of boys, and so Islam continued both the legal tradition and the staunch unitary monotheism. That's why, in a mosque you cannot have any images, just like in a synagogue. And historically, Jews have been more comfortable in entering into mosques compared to the churches because of images, right? I think. Now, which brings me to the point that Islam is deeply connected to Judaism. And you can see that in the dominance of Moses right there. You can see Islam, the Quran, presenting itself as the proclamation of the same monotheism that Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, they're all honored in the Quran and highly praised. Now it's coming to the Arabs. Now, the Arabs were ignorant. They were worshiping in idols. And so Islam was basically this rebirth of Abrahamic monotheism into a pagan context, idolatrous context. And the whole idea was just get rid of the idols, establish the one true God. Now, let's just remember that in the Bible, the Moses story doesn't simply end with the ending of the persecution and with the Exodus. There's the rest of the story. In Islam too, you have an exodus. We call it hijrah. It's migration, from Mecca to Medina. And after Exodus, what does come in the Bible? The conquest of Canaan, right? So there is a military aspect of it. Moses and then Joshua continues the mission. In Islam, you have, after Exodus, the conquest of Hejaz, the Mecca and Medina and those stories. So the Prophet Muhammad's second period, in the first period, Prophet Muhammad and his first believers, peace be upon him, as we would say, peace be upon Moses and all the prophets, Jewish prophets too. They are a persecuted minority. In that sense, Islam in its first 13 years is very much like Roman Christians under Rome. But in Christianity, it went on 3 centuries of persecution. In Islam, it's just the first 13 years. Then, that transition to power happens very quickly. He goes to Medina, and in Medina, he's welcomed by the Arabs there. By the way, there's an interesting question Muslims rarely ask, but it's there in the Islamic tradition. The answer is, why did these Arabs in Medina welcome Muslims while their own people persecuted them? Because there were Jews in Medina, and they had brought the idea of monotheism to the city. And Medinan Arabs were looking up to Jews as the cool people with a scripture, with a written book, and it was something they got interested in. But then this time, monotheism came from the Arab prophet. To make the story short, after Muslims go to Medina, soon a revelation comes, a new revelation. And it's the first verse in the Quran that allowed armed struggle in the name of God. Jihad fi sabilillah, basically striving in the path of God, but armed struggle. And the word jihad can mean many things. It could be an intellectual struggle, it could be a spiritual, but it could be a military one too, and it's there. So the first verse that allowed in Surah Hajj 22, second chapter of the Quran, it says, those who have been persecuted have been given the permission to God because they have been wronged and they have been taken out of their homes only for saying our Lord is God. So jihad was allowed because they were persecuted. Not that the other guys were simply infidels, but they had persecuted them. Because after the persecution, still there were believers in Mecca. They were persecuted, and their properties were plundered. So they were still hostile enemies. So so it was a defensive idea in the very beginning, the whole jihad idea. But the wars continued. I mean, in the last 10 years of the Prophet Muhammad, you had battles after battles with the polytheists and their allies, shifting allies. And that's why you have passages in the Quran about war. Go and fight them, go be steadfast in battle, take the swords and, go and kill them. Now, them is not your neighbor living in somewhere. Them is the particular Meccan polytheists who were persecuting the Muslims in the first place. So it's not a universal declaration for violence, but it's there. Again, a bit like the Hebrew Bible. There are passages in the Hebrew Bible that many of us may be familiar with. There are battles between, the Israelites and their enemies. Are those passages still relevant today? Are there universally applicable wars for conquest? Many Jews would say no. I agree with them. And I would say the same thing for the jihad verses in the Quran. I mean, they reflect the exceptionally violent context. That's not the human reality. But some people can say, no, they are relevant. We want them to be relevant. We want to quote them in our struggles. And then you have religiously justified violence, which has happened in the history of Christianity, Judaism, and certainly it still happens in Islam. It still happens in every tradition, I can say, I think, if I'm not wrong. And I think we should challenge those interpretations by, putting scripture in its proper context. Now, Prophet Muhammad passed away, and Islam, after him, Muslims had a successor, caliph to Prophet Muhammad. And those successors, their political successors, continued an empire that stretched in a century from Spain to India. It just created the world's one of the most majestic empires, and very fast, rapidly. Historians have been marveled at that. Muslims just destroyed the Sassanid Empire, which were for centuries, really minimized the Byzantine empires. And they created this huge religious political entity. Now, and Islamic law and Islamic theology took place within this imperial context. So Muslims had power, and they were speaking from a position of power. They did not consider other religions equal to them. Islam was clearly the true religion, so Muslims would have more rights than others. This was not a surprising thing at the time, and everybody was doing it. I mean, especially Christians loved conquering. So there's nothing to judge, I think, from our modern point of view. And on the other hand, these Islamic empires for their time were actually tolerant by the standards of the time. That's why the Jewish communities, for example, in the Middle East, they often welcomed Islamic conquests, actively aided them at times, especially in Spain. When Muslims, sorry? Spain, exactly. When Muslims conquered Spain, passing through the Mediterranean, what became known as Gibraltar, Spain was under the Visigothic rule, which were very oppressive and very anti-Semitically oppressive on the Jewish minority. So Jewish minority welcomed the conquerors and actually aided them. And there are Christian texts of the time showing Jews as the fifth column of the Muslims, And I think the lesson from there is that if you oppress a minority, they will obviously look out for some savior, and it's your problem. It's not their. I mean, it's you are the one that is guilty. And throughout history, Muslims and Jews coexisted, and in these long centuries, Iraq became a center of Jewish learning under Islamic rule. Muslims learned from Jewish sources. There's a tradition in Islam called Israeliyat, which means from the Israelites, basically studying Jewish sources and learning, because the Quran sometimes tells a short story, the longer its stories in the Bible. Go learn from there, or other Jewish sources. Jews studied Islamic theology, philosophy, and Sufism. During my research, it was a surprise to learn that the son of the great Moses Maimonides, Abraham Maimonides, who was the head of the Jewish community in Egypt, became a Sufi, a practicing Sufi. And he said, these Muslims have great traditions. Actually, it's they just kept it, we forgot it. So they tried to bring in Sufi practices into Judaism and initiated a Jewish Sufism movement in Egypt in the 12th century. And there's a new book about that, very interesting. Because, now why this was possible, Islam being the third of the three big, Abrahamic religions. Now, when you're a newcomer, you have to say things about the people before you, right? They were already there. I mean, in the beginning, there were the Jews, obviously. So, and the Christians said something about the Jews. Sometimes some positive, sometimes negative things. The negative stuff became a problem over time. But Islam came on top of two of them. It said things about them. So when you read the Quran, you will hear passages about Jews and Christians. Some are friendly, some are not that friendly. And I'll tell you, it depends on the context, really. Like Prophet Muhammad had a battle with one of the pro-Byzantine Christian tribe, and it got really heated at the moment, and you have passages about that. And the Jewish tribes in Medina, at some point, first it was very tolerant, and there was a pluralistic constitution with them, to Muslims their religion, to Jews their religion. Then it collapsed into expulsion and violence. But in my book, I have a whole chapter on that, what really happened in Medina. My argument was more political than religious, than what people think. The bottom line is Muslims accepted Judaism and Christianity as legitimate monotheisms, but from a position of power, again. So, now, this went on until the modern era, and ideas of hierarchy started to be challenged by ideas of equality. Now, what do I mean by that? In the classical Islamic system, Muslims were the ruling class. Christians and Jews were tolerated, but they had to pay extra taxes. They could not carry weapons. Muslims could. In their testimony in the courts, Muslims had more authority. So there were like certain supremacy measures as we think. And people today look at that and say, oh my God, Islam was so oppressive and so on. Well, at its time, it was considered normal and actually even better than the alternatives. But in the modern era, a new thing that appeared, which I mentioned, liberalism, the idea of everybody is equal under the law. It's what created the US Constitution. I mean, every man is created equal. They didn't mean every maybe human being there, including women and of course, African Americans, unfortunately. But at least the statement was good. And then we would build upon that through bringing every human being into it, really. Now, does Islam accept this equality for everyone, legal equality, everyone having equal rights? Now, there are some people who still do not, I'll tell you. They have names like the Taliban, or, you might have heard them, like the Iranian regime or the Saudi government. They still believe in a Muslim supremacy and not allowing Jews and Christians, let alone atheists, be who they are fully. But there has been an evolution of doctrine in Islam, and I think it's significant that the Ottoman Empire, the very seat of the caliphate, and the very safe haven for Jews for centuries, by the way, when they escaped from Spain and other places in Europe, they actually declared equal citizenship in the empire in 1856, and then the Constitution of 1876, which honored the caliphate. So there's also a more progressive reinterpretive tradition in Islam. Today, the problem in the Muslim world is that on the one hand, you have some teachings that still uphold supremacy, believe that Islam should be the supreme religion and it should be imposed by the state. So this is the theocratic model that you have in a few Muslim majority countries, not everywhere, in some places. On the other hand, the modern world is demanding equal rights for everybody, rightly so. And I believe in reinterpretation of the Islamic tradition towards that. In other words, giving up coercive power, giving up hegemonic power for equality under the law for everywhere. This is within the legal system. But the modern Muslim dilemma is defined by something else too. It's not just about claiming power. It is also losing power radically and sometimes tragically. Because in the past 2 centuries, what Muslims have experienced is also Western powers or Russian power in Central Asia came on top of them as colonial rulers or aggressors, as the new dominant world system. So Muslims started to see, oh my God, Algeria got colonized, Egypt got colonized, and then Libya, and then, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. And it's like much of the Muslim world found itself under colonial rule in the 19th century. And even when those powers pulled out, they didn't totally leave the region. They kept endless wars and interventions. And Russia has done a big part of oppressing Muslim societies in the Caucasus and Central Asia. So Muslims think that they are the God's chosen people, right? I mean, they must be powerful, but quite the contrary. You find yourself oppressed because you lack power. Now, power can corrupt, and powerlessness can corrupt in a different way. It can make you a zealot. It can make you reactionary, right? And the Islamic civilization is going through that in the past few centuries. And I'll end with that. Again, I think among all people, the Jewish people can relate to this trauma in the modern world. And for that, I have to refer to Arnold Toynbee, the great historian of the 20th century. Arnold Toynbee made an incredible analogy in one of his writings. He said, the modern day Muslim world is a bit like the state of Israelites at the time of Rome, at the time of Jesus Christ, which you told us about, Elaine. I mean, what was the context of Jews in the first century? They believed that they were God's chosen people, right? They had a temple, they had a land, but Romans came on top of them, right? And Romans started to rule them, and not just politically, but also culturally too. There's a Hellenization. And how do you respond to this Roman challenge? And Toynbee says, when civilizations face such challenges, 2 extremes come out. One are the zealots. The other one is the Herodians and zealots. He make these. So Herod was, of course, this Jewish ruler who collaborated with Rome and oppressed his own people. So and also tried to Hellenize his society. So he compares to the dictators in the Muslim world who sometimes collaborated with foreign powers but didn't have legitimacy. But then you have the fanatics, the zealots, who want to launch wars and provoke and more. But I also believe that, and I find it very interesting, there was a third way, the way of Jesus of Nazareth. And I don't know how accurately it is narrated in the Gospels, but theologically speaking, I think Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew proud of his religion, not bowing down to Rome, but not launching, suicidal campaigns against it as well. He was trying to reform his people, uphold their faith and reform their faith and morals. So I think in the Islamic world too, there has been that direction as well. Don't get obsessed with politics, don't get obsessed with capturing power back, but also, reform your religion, reform your people, uplift your people, and for a better future. I think the issue here is regarding Islam. On principle, in Islamic teachings and doctrines, Muslims should accept, and a lot of do, but some people resist, like having really equal rights under the law with everyone. And you shouldn't have a state that is run by Sharia, Islamic law, because you ultimately oppress other people's, even other Muslim communities are oppressed by your version of the Sharia. So there's that problem. But there's the other problem. If you give up power, who captures it? Who gets it? And if the other guys will get it and they will come after you, you don't want to give it. It becomes this kind of vicious cycle. That's why it's important to have both within the countries we have, like America, and in the international system. We should set up the game in a way that it's not a zero-sum game where one person, one group, one nation captures power and persecutes the other one. We should constrain and build institutions and frameworks where everybody can be free under the law. Everybody can have equal safety and dignity under the law. And I believe the same thing for Israel and Palestine. I believe that you have two people, one of them captured power, the other one lost power. But then it has a zealots, that came out of that, unfortunately, which did wrong things on October 7 and before. What's the way forward? Well, I'll just end with that. There's this, infamous slogan, from the river to the sea. People have been saying that. I have a version of that slogan. From the river to the sea, both people should be free and all children should be safe. So that's also, I think, an ideal that we Muslims and Jews and Christians can live with regarding the Israeli-Palestinian context. And that's a way where nobody will be fully deprived of power, but nobody will be also abusing power for domination. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. How do you want us to pronunciate it? Because no one pronunciates my name right.
Mustafa is good.
Mustafa, or is it Mustafa? It's Mustafa.
Second one, Mustafa.
Mustafa?
There's no accent, which is very
It's just
strange for an
Mustafa.
American. Yeah, Mustafa, yeah.
Mustafa, got it. Thank you. You put on, as I was listening to you, you were just like Elaine in a different way. Elaine was looking at the stories we tell and where did they come from. And the fact that there are stories that we didn't even know where they came from, and even your own experience of discovering them. What you were doing in most of your presentation was one of the most critical things for traditions to move, to engage, and to move in any way. And that was this constant process of interpretation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You were one of the classic examples, or one of the most radical models of interpretation, is historical contextualization.
Okay.
It's one of the most radical ones. It's the ones that traditionalists are most frightened from. Yeah. Because you don't know which, like when you said, like from the beginning, your most revolutionary statement was, these are just, you said, we know that Jesus existed. Now let's look at the Gospels, because they have no historical, and in a sense, no theological authority as fact. There was a move. You're doing it saying, okay, everybody, there's all these things you know about Islam. And one of the great challenges of being a Muslim in America, or being a Muslim in broader society, in non-Muslim societies, or it's probably actually even a bigger challenge within Muslim societies, is what does everybody know about you? What is it that everybody knows? And I told Mustafa the story of how last night my plane took off from Detroit, delayed by an hour and a half, came to the promised land of Grand Rapids, and
But couldn't reach there.
couldn't reach. I was Moses.
Right at the edge.
The airport was shut down, and so we had to go back to the desert, and I found a driver. Actually, my assistant found the driver who brought me here. Multiple hours later, and this man, his name is Raj, and he's from Pakistan. He actually said he's going to listen to today. And I'm a friendly person. Where are you from? What's your, where? And Raj said, I'm from Pakistan, but I don't care about Pakistan. Now, it turns out that Raj is actually a theologian. He actually is. He has a whole Torah about a lot of things. But my initial feeling was,
Like a Jewish theologian?
My initial feeling was that Raj wanted to make me feel safe. Like he had to feel safe. So his way of doing that was saying, don't worry, I'm not one of them, right? And I think the model, Mustafa, of what you're trying to present is to say, I don't want to, I want to own. How do I be a Muslim? Not by saying, don't worry, but by saying, let me tell you how I play with I want to serve as a model of how I play with my tradition. And as you were playing, I heard Jewish rabbis all the time doing these type of contextual, textual declarations and statements. What was this and that? And first of all, I want to thank it. That model, besides the move itself, is a critical model for Americans to hear. Because Americans, by and large, are really good to Jews. We're not good to Muslims. We don't give you your generous readings. And maybe it's because Christians and Muslims still have some battle for who's going to be universal domination in which part of the world. But the model of what you declared, yes, there's a lot of bad things in my tradition. There's a lot of beautiful things. Notice how my tradition, and you said, there's a lot of things that I embrace. And those things, I said, let's look at why they happen. What do they reflect and what do they represent? That model of interpretation is of great challenge. Internally, how do you have the courage to interpret? How do you convince your own people of the legitimacies of your interpretations? Because you, like I, we're in the midst of a cultural war, even, over what's the face of our tradition. And you represent a third challenge, and that is whether other people let you do your interpretive moves, or whether they've fallen in love with a certain reading of your tradition, which serves their own stories. And as you were telling them, as you know, I spent many years of my life studying Islam and Christianity, and I have a deep love for Islam. And it's the similarities between us are so. The need for this type of modeled interpretive Islam is something that our world needs, and I want to thank you for it, and may many follow in your path. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, let me help. Thank you so much. I mean, it's humbling to hear that from you, Rabbi Doniel, and I also appreciate you engaging with Muslims and expressing your respect for Islam, and to emphasize that yes, American society by and large doesn't yet fully get Islam, and sometimes it doesn't get fairly, right? I mean, there are reasons for it. 9/11 happened and people heard something on the news and that they thought that was Islam, or Hezbollah attack, a few things. But those are really just strategic conflicts that just erupted in the past couple of decades. I mean, I'm telling Americans, just look at newspapers from 50 years ago. Nobody in America was worried about Islam. It was all about communism, and Muslims were the allies most of the time that you were supporting. So the political crises in the Middle East especially just erupted in a way that really put Muslims and the West or the US in sometimes in conflict or tension. But these are not theological wars most of the time. They get religionized by the people. I mean, typical example, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it's a secular nationalisms initiated this conflict. Then the religious people came in with all the scriptures they can bring in to further, be stronger in that battle. But it's a political thing. So regarding the Jewish people, I believe that we are the closest to religions on earth. I mean, in terms of practices and structures and theologies. we were fine for a long time, and this 100-year land dispute has been putting us apart, and we are at its darkest phase now after October 7 and the catastrophic, war in Gaza. But let's work to resolve this peacefully. Otherwise, we're doomed. But if we can resolve this, we have a world. I mean, like we all have a lot of issues in defending kosher laws in Switzerland or somewhere like that. I mean, a lot of things actually bring us together on religious freedom, on values, and but thank you. I know your work's on this too. But thank you for your comments too. I'm humbled to hear those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this is really enlightening. Thank you, both of you. I was struck when I was reading your book on views of Jesus in Islam. I hadn't realized, I knew he was regarded as a prophet and so forth. I hadn't realized what you said, that there's no negative view of Jesus, that he's seen positively as a prophet in the line of Moses, not Moses as a prophet, but in the line of the prophets that leads up to Muhammad, and also the stories there. But I was also very struck what you said today about how things are, how the story, how Muhammad was using as a template the Moses story. I've just been writing a book about the Jesus stories. And all of this impresses me with the power of the Hebrew scriptures, because they're all patterned on the Hebrew Bible. I just realized writing that the story of Jesus in Mark, the earliest gospel, follows event to event to event in Mark's gospel, the Passover story. I won't go into it, but it does. And you're talking how, that same story has inspired, the way that Muslims interpret their own culture. It's amazing. And I also appreciate what Daniel said, because you are also talking about the variety in the tradition today, the many groups, and the tendency of people who don't know Islam very well to identify with Sharia law in a restrictive, very highly restrictive of women, very, what do you call it, insulated, within a Muslim world and so forth, and autocratic in the ancient sense of the word, as it has sometimes been, and how you're also presenting a range of Islam in the very way you talk about it. And, to your own view as a Muslim who cares deeply about the tradition and who's also helping transform it, right? And translate it, as we all are. So that's also important. I'm very glad we're here to hear that. And so I'd love to hear from other people here about responses to that, but after yours.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Can I use all these beautiful words as blurbs, give it to my publicist or something? I'm kidding.
Just tell your mother.
My mother, yes, she should
Forget
hear.
the
Exactly,
publicist.
yeah.
Your
I haven't
mother.
translated it into Turkish to some extent, but yeah, we'll do it. Well, thank you so much. That's so kind of you. And thank you for taking a look at my book, reading my book, The Islamic Jesus, too. Now, I appreciate it all. You made a few points, and let me say a few things about that. Indeed, in the Quran, that is interesting. In Judaism, there's not a scriptural text about Jesus, because Jesus comes afterwards, like he's a late Jew. But in Islam, there is. And there's utmost respect to Jesus and Mary, by the way. Mary is the only female figure in the Quran who's mentioned by name. There's a chapter after her called Mary, right? Maryam in Arabic. And when you read that chapter, you basically get the Luke's gospel virgin birth story. So he was this chaste virgin, and God sent an angel and gave him a baby. It was without a father, and the baby came miraculously. There are differences. For example, he doesn't give birth in Bethlehem, but somewhere in the wilderness under a palm tree. By the way, those differences between the Quran and the New Testament get very interesting when you look at apocryphal Gospels. For example, there is a miracle story in the Quran where Jesus takes a piece of clay and he breathes into it, and that clay, he makes it like a bird and becomes a live bird and flies away. Now, I tell this story to my Christian friends in America, and I'm saying, are you familiar with this? They said, no, we never heard about that. What is this? It's not in the Bible. I said, yeah, it's not in the Bible. It's not in the New Testament. But if you read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, you will see it there. In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus takes a piece of clay. He makes not one, but 12 birds, but it's the same story. So it is in that story. Or there are stories in the Quran about Mary being raised in the temple, the Jewish temple, which you don't find in the New Testament. You find them in the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is the proto-gospel, telling, again, the stories of Mary's childhood. So, by the way, there's a new Netflix series coming with Mary. I think there are themes about that. So when you're watching it, you see that there are things in the Quran which you can see there as well, and also the Proto-Evangelium of James. So the Quran is in dialogue with all these Christian traditions. Now, where do they come from? As a Muslim, I'll tell you it comes from Revelation. But I think I can understand how others can say, well, where did this get into Quran? So that what's the historical connection between Prophet Muhammad? And there's a whole academic literature on that. Where did these stories, how did they reach to 7th century Mecca and made their way into the Quran? So which Christian communities were there? I mean, like, was it the monophysites? Was it the others? There's actually an interesting theory on Islam's origins being in Jewish Christianity. I don't know if you know Jewish Christianity tradition. Of course you do, but there were these sects in 2nd, 3rd centuries. We know from the writings of church fathers. These are pious Jews, observant Jews who accept Jesus, but as the Jewish Messiah, not as the Christian Christ. So, and they see Jesus as a human, but the Messiah. And they value James, patron saint, whose letter is the most Jewish and Islamic text I found in the New Testament. When I read the New Testament, I said, who's this James? What he's saying is 100% Islamic. And, oh, he's the brother of Jesus. Well, what's the connection? So actually so there is a Jewish Christianity strain, and some historians speculated that Jewish Christianity might have survived all the way to, people think it died out after for a few centuries. But anyway, there are so textual connections there, definitely. Yeah, sorry. No, go ahead.
I was also realizing that the objections that Jews and Muslims have to Christianity is to a view that arises nearly 400 years after the death of Jesus, which is that he is somehow God, that he is a divine being. I mean, the Gospel of John suggests that he comes from the divine source, but it doesn't speak of him as God. Well, it does. Maybe
Logos, maybe.
John's Gospel does talk about Jesus almost as God walking around as a human being. And that is debated in the 4th century, and that's put into the creed when Constantine is emperor, and that's part of what makes Christian empire powerful. I mean, it's the idea that Christ is the patron of the emperor, and the emperor is inspired by Christ and authorized by Christ. And since Christ is God, that's all part of the imperial, I was going to say, fantasy. So some of us have trouble with it within Christian tradition too, taken the way it often is. It's an important point.
Yeah. I mean, one more thing. The Quran even actually emphasizes Jesus is not just even a mere human, because, I mean, it uses the word of God for Jesus. Logos. I mean, it sounds like that in the 4th Gospel. So repeatedly, the Quran calls Jesus Messiah, again, which is very interesting. So there are very intricate connections between Quran and the Islamic tradition's view on Jesus, and I think in the Christian tradition. I know Christian tradition has its own strains and very hard to know, actually very complicated and diverse. And I mean, I'm not doing this to challenge the belief in the deity of Christ, and Christian friends of mine believe in that. I respect their point of view. But Islam's view is he was a special prophet created out of a miracle with a virgin birth. And he did miracles, and it's very interesting. The Quran says he was sent to the children of Israel. So he was sent to the Jews as still their prophet. Very interesting emphasis. Anyway, so I'll stop there. Was there something else I should comment
that's
on?
fine.
Thank you.
It'd be fun just to sit and listen to them, wouldn't it? But we want to open it up for other questions that you might have.
I'm interested for your thoughts. At the end of your talk, you reflected on how the power of colonialism affected the spread of Islam in various countries, that they were powerless, so to speak. And years ago, I read a book called Ibn Sa'd, the desert warrior that created the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I remember he consolidated power among nomadic culture. And then, if I remember correctly, he made sort of a pact with a radical imam to spread a particular type of Islam. And,
Wahhabism? Yeah.
Yeah. And that gained enough power so that when it came to getting out from under the Ottomans and negotiating with the British, he avoided some of that colonialism that you've referred to. Did that imam and did that affect all the universal Islam a lot? Not just in Saudi Arabia, but that gaining that power and spreading that form of Islam. Did it affect other countries?
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. You're referring to the beginnings of the Saudi dynasty and state formation in late 18th century, and he allied with in Najd, the central part of Saudi Arabia, which the Ottomans considered like even not worthy of conquering. There's nothing there, just a few deserts and Bedouins, but the Ottomans ruled Hijaz and the coasts. There emerged this alliance between him and a cleric named Ibn al-Wahhab, Muhammad Abdul Ibn al-Wahhab, and Muhammad Ibn Abdul Wahhab, sorry. It became known as Wahhabism. So that is the most rigid interpretation of Sunni Islam. Like there's a Sunni spectrum, which might have still problems on some issues of women's rights and so on and so forth, but it can be taken to different directions. So Wahhabism emerged as this ultra-Orthodox Sunnism, and it started to condemn other Muslims as heretics and infidels, especially Sunnis who engage in Sufism, that would be Ottomans, and the Shiites as well. And they just started on a fierce war against other Muslims. The Ottomans suppressed them a few times. And then the British showed up and they said, we love these guys. They will help our foreign policy. Let's empower them, right? I mean, Western countries make policy decisions with a lot of unintended consequences, which are generally bad. I mean, I can tell you. So ultimately, the Ottoman Empire crumbled. I mean, in World War I, the British were happy that the caliphate is gone. So nice. Now everything will be nice and peaceful. Actually, that's when the radical tide began. And Wahhabism was a part of it. There were also other trends into it. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the politicization of Islam, as people say. Like Islam had always an aspect of state formation and power, but making it the only goal, like reestablishing Islamic states, and it became a passion for these groups. And conflicts like Palestinian conflict, the Kashmir one, in later Bosnia, they just, in these places, all these radical factions came and started to proliferate. And just it created a whole, I think the 20th century has been the worst century of the Islamic civilization, and it's still going on. So I tell some Western friends of mine, they say, oh, why it's such a bad situation? I'm saying, you're not looking at a bad religion, you're looking at a very bad period in its history. And if you looked at 16th century Christianity, you would think that it's not a very liberal religion. I mean, you would see the 30 Years' War, Catholics, Protestants slaughtering each other, Jews trying to save themselves from pogroms, and so on and so forth. If that Christianity had become EU, there's hope for everyone, right? I can say. But we have to invest in better ideas. We have to struggle for them, and we have to resolve the conflicts. Regarding Wahhabism, I mean, it's from Wahhabism, most of the Wahhabis are not violent. They're very strict on tradition, but not violent. But those who go violent, they create the most deadly synthesis. And from that line comes groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and others in Africa like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. And these are the worst of the worst. And they're a threat to other Muslims too. I mean, before anyone else. So those groups have to be obviously marginalized with various means. But we should not forget that wars to end terrorism might become themselves very violent and can create only more terrorism in the future. So it's very important to carry out anti-terror campaigns, whatever they are, wherever they are, in a way that doesn't harm civilians, in a way that really targets the bad people, but gives hope to the others, which is not what's happening in Gaza, if you ask me, for example, which was not the case in some of the other campaigns US had. Which is not what my country did, Turkey, regarding the Kurdish insurgency. There was a Turkish hawkishness to destroy PKK, the Kurdish insurgency, only creating more PKK militants because you hurt a lot of innocent people. And the guy you kill one, and then his nephew wants to take his revenge, and that becomes the second generation. So just a note on the geopolitics of that. Thank you.
You mentioned the overlap between some of the Islamic texts and like the Gnostic Gospels. And Dr. Pagels, I know you've written on the Gnostic Gospels. Within these three religious traditions, there have been these mystery traditions that emerge out of them that share some similar overlap, I think, within Sufism and the rise in popularity of Rumi today, and how so many people connect with that. Can you talk about what that mystery overlap looks like in these religions, where there were these almost like excluded voices that never made its way into the central themes that really called for this inner knowing, this connection to love, and these deeper truths that sort of seemed like a correction to some of the earlier oversights or emphasis in those texts?
Thank you. Great question. Just one thing, I think there are parallels between Quran and apocryphal gospels. Not all of those apocryphal gospels might be Gnostic gospels. I mean, there are some other Eastern traditions that Proto-Evangelium of James and the Infancy Gospel, they're not Gnostic Gospels, I think. Yeah, not at all.
Those are medieval legends. I mean, they're later legends.
Okay.
The secret Gospels I work on are from the first century.
Yeah, there's an Armenian Gospel, for example, which has certain themes that similar to the Quran, but not Gnostic ones. And of course, the New Testament has a lot of parallels with the Quran too. Now, regarding this mystical traditions, I know not that much about the mystical traditions in Christianity and Judaism, but in Islam, it's Sufism, as you mentioned, which was somewhat of a late, comer compared to jurisprudence, which was the first thing. Like in Christianity and like in Judaism, law is the prime law, like the prime science, or halakha and sharia are very similar traditions, and just Jews don't have a halakhic state for 2,000 years, so that's a big difference. But I think Muslims had a sharia state unbroken, so that's why the corporal punishments are still there, while it turned obsolete in Judaism. But regarding Sufism emerged, the thing is, you had the law, okay, but what do you feel, right? So that search in Islam led to the rise of these Sufi orders. And the story is that the Prophet Muhammad had, besides the law and revelation and texts, had this mystical wisdom that he had taught to Ali or Abu Bakr, so some of his companions. And from those, people start, like an oral tradition, it went on and on. So Sufi orders emerged. And Sufi orders basically emphasized closeness to God, feeling God, and they achieved that by constant chanting His name, having musical gatherings, and most of them are obedient to the Orthodox legal tradition, but some of them went into kind of a not sober Sufism, as people would say. Oh, actually, if you drink wine, you feel God better, and like just went into a sort of like a California Sufism, as I would call it, direction. California wasn't there yet, but there was a pushback against that, from the religious authorities. But it's a part of Islamic tradition. One thing, I mean, being a Sufi doesn't mean necessarily you are a modern, liberal, open-minded. Some Sufis are very orthodox because they could be also traditional Sunni, and the teaching there might be very strict. Shia Sufism, same thing as well. So it's a spectrum in itself. The group that would shun Sufism and would consider Sufis totally heretics are the ones we mentioned, Wahhabis. They consider Sufism as a late development, a heresy, a bid'ah. Any bid'ah mean like a bad innovation. So they consider it like that. And that led to even attacks on Sufis. And we've seen that in the Arabian Peninsula. We've seen that even in Pakistan and Iran, in other places, Afghanistan lately. But Sufis also have been sometimes open to engaging with other religious traditions, open to seeing Jesus as their saint, Mary as their saint. So they are sometimes a bit less strict on the religious boundaries, which to me is a good thing. For some people, it's a bad thing, of course. I don't know if this answers your question, but I think you're welcome.
I wish I had read more deeply in 7th century history, but I have read some, and I have an impression, and I would like you, and I'm sure you can correct it. But in the Near East, there was a lot of leadership in mathematics and in the kind of science that actually led to the scientific method centuries later in Western Europe.
Very true.
I have the impression that when the conversion to the Mohammedan religion took place, that there was a strong, if not anti-intellectual, an unintellectual aspect to the religion, which kind of killed off or, ended all that kind of exciting scientific work that had been done previously. Is there any sense in what I'm saying, or do I have a false impression?
Thank you, sir. That's a good question. Regarding books about 7th century, I have one book out there you can buy if you want a copy. You can buy 5 if you want. Regarding the connection between science and Islam, you're right that Arabs actually contributed a lot to Western culture and especially sciences and philosophy and medicine. But that happened thanks to Islam. In the initial first centuries of Islam, people speak of a Islamic enlightenment of the pre-modern era. What happened, and there was a religious pushback against it. You're right about that, but that pushback was not Islam itself, but a certain strain within the religion. This happened when Muslims basically came out of Arabia. They were former nomads and merchants, right? But they just created this big empire, and they conquered Iraq, which was the center of learning. Christians, Jews were there, Hindu traditions, and they were open-minded enough not to destroy these traditions, but to engage with them and to learn from them. And there was this fascinating translation movement, as historians called it. They discovered Greek philosophy, thanks to Christian churches who had preserved them. And they started translating all these ancient Greek books, that is Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Hippocrates, major Greek thinkers, whoever you can think. They translated all of them to Arabic, and then they started to study them, and that's brought a new scientific renaissance and it was an Islamic effort, but Jews and Christians were involved in it too. So it was actually a multi-religious effort. There was this famous Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, that these two things took place. And yes, they had contributions to the West. You can see them in language today. For example, algebra comes from al-Jabir, the Arabic word for mathematics. Algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi, who was the Muslim scholar, polymath, who was studying things. While Arabic numerals obviously come from the Arabic world. By the way, there was a funny story. A few years ago, there was a poll made among American parents. Like, they were asked, do you want your children to learn Arabic numerals? And the majority said, no way, what is that? Like I said, well, I wrote a piece about that. Who's afraid of Arabic numerals? Well, it is the numbers you use every day. Right? And of course, Muslims got them from India. So there was a interaction with civilizations, but that was an openness. And ultimately, Muslims became the greatest commentators on Plato and Aristotle especially. Aristotle fascinated Muslims like Avicenna and later Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Maimonides. By the way, Jews actually became a part of that Greek engagement. And Maimonides initiated a whole Jewish enlightenment in medieval times. If I'm wrong, I'm sure Rabbi Daniel, and that would pave the way for Mendelssohn, if I'm not wrong, all the way into modernity, get some ideas of rationality there. Now, in Islam, it's true that there was a pushback against this. You're right on what you're saying there. But this was not necessarily a requirement of the religion, but more orthodox, let's say, camp, I would say, pushback against this, because if you get too much Greek, you get into ideas about the creation of the world that doesn't look very Quranic or biblical. So there were some Greek metaphysical doctrines that look heretical. So it was seen as heretical. So there was a pushback against it. So there's a decline or stagnation in a later phase in the Islamic civilization. Why is that the case? It's $1 billion question. There are many books and articles on that. But I can say that very history shows that Islam is not close to learning and science and engagement with other cultures. Quite the contrary. It was the religion that did it best, at some point in history. Things are not today very good in the lands of Islam, I mean, as I said. But that actually brilliant history shows that, this is a religion that can be engaging with all cultures with respect and understanding, as it did for many centuries.
As someone who studied mathematics, I was very aware of that, but not in my formal studies. Nothing in college, nothing in my doctoral program even mentioned Muslims and mathematics. And it was later that I learned about al-Khwarizmi and algorithm and algebra and all of that.
All the Al's come from Islam.
Right.
Almanac, Alembic,
And it
Al
was
Jazeera too.
the House of Wisdom was where all of this was. And I also learned that much of the Greek that we wouldn't have if it wasn't for the Arabic translation of the Greek, because the Greek had been lost.
Yeah.
And
Aquinas got, Aristotle from Muslims and got it from those sources, and of course interpreted with a Christian perspective and paved the way to.
And there's the beginning of a renaissance. We had Kaufman had here Nadal Gassoum, who's a Muslim. Do you know Nadal?
Nidal goes. Oh yeah, he's a good friend. Yeah, definitely. He's awesome.
He has spoken here before, but he's trying to find a renaissance for Muslim science, because he admits that it's in most parts of the Muslim world now, it is very poor. It's nothing like it was during the House of Wisdom. So good question and good answer. Any other questions? Yes, over here.
So Jewish people have been coming to the United States since before the Revolutionary War, most of it for economic opportunity, and then probably in the 20th century as refugees. And they've come from not just from the colonial countries, but from Russia, from the Middle East and Central Asia and so on. But Muslims coming to the United States, is that fairly recent? And like, as a Jewish person, we're pretty comfortable in the United States. I mean, things are okay. But and we're not going back. I have nowhere to go back to. And so how's let's call it the Muslim diaspora, how is that looking?
Well, I'm still discovering the American Muslim scene, but what I know is, I think 100 years ago, probably the only big Muslim community was the African American Muslim community, the Nation of Islam. But that was also a very unorthodox interpretation of Islam, very like not like proper Islam, in many ways. I think from the 16 onwards, when racial quotas in America were lifted on immigration, from 16 onwards, new Muslim communities started to come in, and either from the Arab world or the subcontinent, like Indian or Pakistani Muslims, I think majority. But there has been other Turks like myself, Bosnians, and there are a lot of Muslim communities. And today, I think there are 5 to 6 million Muslims in America, I think. It's very diverse. You can find all interpretations of Islam. And it's great. They all coexist. There's no problem. I mean, there's no heretics getting persecuted for that. I had a conversation with a Sheikh Yasir Qadi, who's a prominent Islamic scholar. He gave a sermon, which I loved. He's more conservative than me on many issues, I should say, but he's an American Muslim leader. And he gave a lecture to all American Muslims. And he said, to American Muslims, hundreds of them. And he said, look, we American Muslims are luckier than any other Muslim on earth because we live in a country which has a constitution which is designed to protect our freedom. And that's not most countries in the world are, he said. Even in Muslim majority countries, we're not this free to say whatever we want and whatever we can say and preach our religion. And we had a conversation with Yasir Qadi at the Acton Institute here, actually, with Nathan, my colleague, Nathan Mack being the moderator. And I said to Yasir Qadi, I love that sermon of yours. I agree with you. He said, we thank Allah for this constitution. I said, yeah, I thank Allah for the US Constitution. And I said, therefore, I would bring the same idea to Saudi Arabia and Iran and Pakistan and like a limited government, neutral on religion, secular separation of state. There, he didn't go fully with me, but he appreciates the US model. I think most Muslims who come to America appreciate this country with its laws and opportunities and of course they're worried about Islamophobia and all that, but they understand that it's not policy of the government, it's just some hotheads in the society or bigots in society. They might have problems with American foreign policy though. That's a different thing. It's probably a lot of them has these days regarding the Middle East, but they appreciate this country as is, and it is diverse. And I think one thing, Catholicism was not very open to ideas of full religious freedom until the 20th century. The separation of church and state was not accepted by the Catholic Church. American Catholics and their experience helped the Catholic Church to see that secularism is a good thing. Actually, thanks to that, our Catholics in America are free and do whatever they want. So separation of church and so that, my Catholic friend tell me that feedback from American Catholics helped Vatican to take the step in the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, religious freedom. I hope and believe that there is a Muslim experience in the West, like where Muslims see, you don't need a Sharia-based state to live by your religion. You actually need a free state that is neutral just because, and you just need a government like that. So that might be a good feedback on other Muslims. Therefore, this experience should not be derailed by people who want to put Muslim bans and expel Muslims or ban Qurans. And there are some figures like that, I think, in the West these days on the populist side. But I think we should keep the American experiment of pluralism with equal justice under the law for everyone. It's precious. And foreign policy is a different thing. We can speak about that some other day.
In terms of where Muslims are earlier, it's estimated that up to 1/3 of the slaves were Muslim when they arrived here. And also there were Muslims before the revolution, free Muslims in the North. So there is a long history here.
Yeah, okay.
Next session, to start in about 15 minutes, will be about owning the power, how each of the religions needs to own the problem that power brings them. We've heard some of that already, but we're going to deal with that. And then this evening, we're going to deal with the whole question of nationalism and how nationalism leads to extremism. I just want to add one more thing, because I know that Christopher Stendhal was one of the first persons here to dialogue. I know that Christopher Stendhal was a very important person in Elaine Pagels' work at Harvard when he was dean there while you were a student. And he's also been very important to informing me and my knowledge and getting up to speed at the Kaufman Institute. And what I love about Christopher Stendhal is he had 3 rules for interfaith. The first one was learn from the adherents, not from the enemies. Today we have learned from the adherents, and we appreciate that. And we're all minorities, and Sylvia adds. But his second rule was don't compare your best with their worst. And what we're trying to do here today is own our worst as well as our best. So, and the third rule is one that I've incorporated a lot in the Kaufman work, and it is be prepared for holy envy. Holy envy is when you understand another religion so much that you're actually envious of some of the things that they do that your own faith doesn't. He calls it holy. It's not a bad envy, a holy envy. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Join us for session 2 in about 15 minutes. Thank you.